Let me tell you a tale. It's about my dad. Well, really, it's about my dad's hair. For as long as I can remember, he had this same haircut. Short on the sides, parted on the left, bangs brushed and sprayed firmly to the side. It was the classic kind of dad do. But as Dolly Parton once said, time marches on, and eventually it marches across your face. And for Dad, time marched across his hairline because it really began to thin, and he clung to that same style, that same routine. He couldn't see that it really wasn't working for him anymore. And eventually, I hate to say it, but you know it became the comb-over. And we begged him, please cut it like you have a nice head. You're gonna be okay. But he couldn't let it go. Not until we gave him something else to think about. And I'll give credit, it was Rachel's idea. And when she pitched it to the rest of the whole family, we eagerly agreed. It just might work. So the next time that we were all together, Rach just casually put it out there. You know what, Jolly, she said, with those new glasses, if you got your hair cut kind of in a short buzz, I think you might just look like Ed Harris. Now, this was a stretch, okay? But he liked Ed Harris because, Apollo 13 and Pollock and The Truman Show. It gave him something to imagine, a different picture. A future self that was different, but was good. Blessedly. Days later, Dad came back in with a close crop. Victory, we declared. And all it took was a new image, a real alternative to consider, a possibility to move him over the comb-over. And we all need that. Something to help us see things differently, especially when we've been doing the same things over and over and over again. So here we are in Luke 14, and Jesus is at a dinner party, and he's in the home of a religious leader, someone viewed as a moral compass, a guardian of the right way to live. And as we learn from the scripture, it's not a casual gathering, it's a political one, it is staged. So it's tensed. We're told they were watching him closely. Before Jesus says a word about honor or humility, before appetizers even, he notices someone in need. As Kay reminded us last week, that's just what Jesus does. He notices. And he brings compassion to the center, even if it does break a rule. He asks that room, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? Everyone goes quiet. Jesus heals the need and restores the person. Because of course he does. Because mercy is more important than manners. Then, moments later, the guests are trying to jockey for the best seats. Now, I have to think that Jesus is eye-rolling here, right? I mean, this is so us. I imagine him thinking, are you kidding me? You need another lesson? Like, geez Louise, what can I do, people? That last one wasn't clear enough. Fine, try this one. So Jesus tells a story. And it's a story not just about party etiquette, but about the way that the world could be. A flipped, reordered, inclusive world. That's the world that God wants for us. Now, to help us take the full meaning of what Jesus is up to, I gotta think about Walter Brueggemann, the prophetic theologian who passed away earlier in the summer. He called the church to reconceive of faithfulness through justice and imagination and the disruption of empire. He taught, imagination must come before implementation. He writes, the prophet engages in futuring fantasy, does not ask if the vision can be implemented for questions of implementation or of no consequence until the vision can be imagined. He writes, our culture, this is great, our culture is competent to implement almost anything and to imagine almost nothing. Imagination is a danger. Every totalitarian regime is frightened of it. Now, Jesus is conjuring that kind of a radical future, offering a real alternative. And he's telling those gathered and us, stop with the same old, stop maintaining the same power dynamics and structures and calling it right and good. Now, Jesus isn't offering just this rearranged table. He's calling into being a remade world. And it's starting by just thinking about it. And that's still radical. Now, here's something unique about this vision that he does cast, and I do think it's very important. When the banquet is getting planned, and this guest list that he's talking about expands, Jesus, of course, names those that are typically excluded. We get this, right? The poor, persons with disabilities, the overlooked. But unlike in the other gospel stories, there's no healing the parts of them that make them different from normative culture, from normative folks. There's no fixing here. There is no expectation of transformation for those named. That is, except the host. Jesus flips that usual script. The ones who need to change are the ones doing the inviting, the ones with the house, the power, the privilege. So this isn't a story about fixing somebody's body. It's about fixing our assumptions, our thinking, shifting it to a more just way. It's about remaking community with real space, real bodies, and real dignity. Jesus gives us this blueprint for what faithfulness could look like when you are holding on to privilege. To those with privilege, Jesus says, you change. You adapt and actively decenter yourself. You set a table where no one has to overcome to belong. How about that? Where inclusion isn't earned, it's just embodied. This is personal, but it's also political. Because if we really imagine with Jesus this new way of being in community, the implications stretch far beyond who gets invited to game night. Those implications, they shape budgets and policies. They even shape who lives and who dies. After the flash floods in Kerr County, Texas, floods that claimed over 135 lives, including 27 kids from Camp Mystic, mothers and climate advocates, they gathered near the White House, and they brought 27 flowered-covered trunks, each honoring a child that never came home from camp. But they didn't stick to their expected narrative of grieving, accepting mothers. They weren't just grieving. They refused this narrative of inevitability. They pointed not to nature for this catastrophe, but to policy, to the defunding of NOAA and FEMA and the National Weather Service. They chanted, "We need warnings, not cuts." They said these children didn't die because of a natural disaster. They died because of political choices, preventable ones. That's prophetic imagination. Mothers refusing to normalize systemic failure. They stood in their grief, and then they demanded a government to care because they imagined a better world, and then they demanded it. Now, moments ago, Jim read Espada's fierce and gorgeous poem, Imagine the Angels of Bread. And it's this great litany of reversals, right? Landlords evicted, refugees deporting judges, farm workers reclaiming the deeds to the land. But it's not just fantasy for fantasy's sake. It's poetry as protest, as prophetic possibility. That's Jesus' work, right? And sometimes we're too stuck on these old stories to think that a new one can truly be written. So Jesus tells us stories that flip tables and center the ones who get pushed to the margins. He's not doing it to shock, but to awaken us to real alternatives, to stretch our sight line until we can see a different world, one we must imagine before we can build it. Just days ago, I listened to Professor Alex Vitale speak about the rising tide of surveillance and policing in our communities. He runs the Policing and Social Justice Project at CUNY, and his work names how deeply this mindset has saturated our cities. ICE is in our parks and our subway stations. The National Guard is just roaming around DC, standing in front of ice cream shops. Police raids on unhoused encampments are taking place while everybody is asleep. Professor Vitale explains it's been a really striking development over the last couple of decades to see the ways in which cities have basically given up the possibility of actually solving their social problems. They've thrown up their hands around homelessness, thrown up their hands about providing people with adequate health care, with mental health care, and with fixing the schools. Cities have doubled down on policing to manage those problems, but not to solve them. So if we accept this table, the one that is set by empire, we don't look deeper. We don't question this, right? And then very easily, we start blaming job-stealing immigrants. We criminalize the homeless. We reach for punishment instead of provision. But almost worse than that, we don't identify the depth and the reach of systemic failures that have caused those problems to begin with, like deindustrialization, low-wage jobs, structural racism, and a total lack of affordable housing. We forget to change those systems. We forget to ask, what could we become? We forget that we really are capable, more than capable, to change our ways, our hearts, and our society. There is so much to heal. And thank God, Jesus shows us how to begin. It's simple. Start by getting your mind free. Start by wondering, what could be if, what a powerful word, if. When empire thinking shows up in our communities, blocking potential and greatly needed transformation, we gotta fight back. Think bigger, love wider, hope harder. Nothing changes otherwise, because we can expect just more of the same. Imperial mindset creeps into our hearts too. And we've got to stop ourselves from policing prophecies and stunting our vision to alternatives. Augusto Boal, Brazilian activist and theater maker, called that mental trap the cop in the head. Living under oppressive structures, we internalize those messages like whether we know it or not. It's that voice that creeps into our head that says, don't speak up. You don't belong. Stay in your place. That voice is a lie. It is not the gospel. And Jesus calls us to call that out. Jesus calls us to the table of expanding grace. Jesus says, hey, Come on in, everybody. Take your seat, bring your voice, bring your perspective, and make some room, because others are going to join us too. Kingdom thinking interrupts our programming, and it reshapes how we're going to relate to others, but also to ourselves. It risks creating what has not yet been, but what could really be. Brueggemann reminds us, hope is the refusal to accept the reading of our reality, which is the majority opinion. Jesus gives us subversive hope through his stories, through his life. He teaches us a different way from the one that the world really wants us to just take. Following Jesus' way into God's world, we're going to find that there's a banquet where the vulnerable are honored, and there's an economy of shared life, and there's a faith that chooses compassion over custom, and there's a celebration of dreaming up what hasn't been, but what could be. And friends, we gotta believe we can get there. So this week, let's not ask ourselves, what have we always been doing? Let's ask instead, what kind of world are we putting energy into? What are we imagining? What could we become? I wonder.